The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Windsor as thousands of people gathered along the parade route. Margaret Thompson clutched her small purse tightly, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she pushed through the crowd. At 73 years old, she had seen many royal parades, but today felt different. Today, she carried a secret that had weighed on her heart for over 50 years. The royal procession was scheduled to begin at precisely 11 o'clock, and Margaret had arrived early to secure a spot near the front barriers. She wore her best navy blue dress, the one she had saved for special occasions, and a small pearl brooch that had belonged to her mother. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and despite her age, her green eyes sparkled with determination. As she waited, Margaret's mind drifted back to 1971, when she was just 21 years old and working as a young nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in London. It was during the height of winter when a mysterious patient was brought in during the middle of the night. The woman was unconscious, beautifully dressed, and clearly from high society. What happened that night would change Margaret's life forever, though she couldn't have known it at the time. The crowd around her began to stir with excitement as the sound of marching bands grew louder in the distance. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, waving small British flags, while tourists snapped photos with their phones. Margaret barely noticed the commotion. Her focus was entirely on what she planned to do when the royal carriage passed by. In her purse, she carried an old photograph, yellowed with age and carefully wrapped in tissue paper. The image showed a young woman holding a newborn baby, both looking peaceful and content. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were the words, "For my darling son, may you always know you are loved. E.M." Margaret had kept this photograph safe for decades, never knowing if she would ever have the opportunity to fulfill the promise she had made that cold winter night. The dying woman had pressed the photo into her hands with her final breath, making Margaret swear that she would somehow get it to its intended recipient. The woman had whispered a name, an address that no longer existed, and a desperate plea that her son would know the truth about his birth. The sound of horses' hooves on stone grew closer, and Margaret could see the first members of the royal guard approaching. Their red uniforms were immaculate, their black horses stepping in perfect rhythm. Behind them would come the royal carriage, carrying members of the royal family to the annual charity event at Westminster Abbey. Margaret's heart began to race as she remembered the woman's final words. She had described a distinctive birthmark, a small crescent moon shape behind the left ear. She had spoken of an adoption that was kept secret, of papers that were destroyed, and of a love affair that could never be acknowledged publicly. Most importantly, she had given Margaret a specific hand signal, a gentle touch to the heart, followed by an upward gesture toward the sky. As the royal guard drew nearer, Margaret studied their faces carefully. She had done research over the years, following news reports and royal announcements. She had narrowed down her search based on ages, birthmarks mentioned in informal interviews, and small details that most people would overlook. Today, she was almost certain she had identified the right person. The crowd erupted in cheers as the royal carriage came into view, but Margaret's attention was focused on one particular guard riding alongside it. Captain James Wellington, age 52, had served in the Royal Guard for over 25 years. His distinguished service record was well known, but his personal history remained largely private. What the public didn't know was that James had always wondered about his true parentage, having been adopted as an infant under mysterious circumstances. Margaret watched as Captain Wellington approached her section of the crowd. He sat tall and proud on his black stallion, his eyes scanning the crowd with professional vigilance. As he drew closer, Margaret could see the small scar behind his left ear, exactly where the dying woman had described the birthmark would be. Her hands shook as she reached into her purse and pulled out the photograph. This was her moment, the chance she had waited 50 years for. She had practiced the gesture countless times in her mirror at home, making sure she could perform it smoothly and clearly. The dying woman had been specific about the timing. It had to be done when he was looking directly at her, and it had to be unmistakable. As Captain Wellington's horse approached her position, Margaret stepped forward slightly, staying within the designated area but making herself visible. She raised her right hand and placed it gently over her heart, then slowly lifted it toward the sky in the exact motion the woman had described. At the same time, she held up the photograph with her left hand, making sure the image was clearly visible. Captain Wellington's trained eyes caught the unusual gesture immediately. Something about the deliberate nature of the movement, combined with the old photograph being displayed, caused him to focus intently on the elderly woman. As his gaze met hers, Margaret mouthed the words that the dying woman had taught her. "From your mother, with eternal love." The effect on Captain Wellington was immediate and profound. His horse suddenly stopped, causing a ripple effect through the formation behind him. His face went pale, and his hands tightened on the reins as he stared at Margaret in complete shock. The photograph in her hands showed a woman who looked remarkably similar to someone he had seen in old royal portraits, someone whose identity had been the subject of whispered rumors for decades. The other guards quickly closed ranks around Captain Wellington, their training kicking in as they assessed what they perceived as a potential security threat. However, Wellington raised his hand, signaling them to hold their positions. His eyes never left Margaret's face as he processed what had just happened. Margaret could see the recognition dawning in his eyes, the gesture, the photograph, and the resemblance between the woman in the image and certain members of the royal family had triggered something deep in his memory. She had succeeded in getting his attention, but now she realized the magnitude of what she had just set in motion. The crowd around them began to murmur with confusion as the parade came to an unexpected halt. Security personnel started moving through the crowd, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Margaret felt a moment of panic, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake by choosing such a public moment to reveal the secret. Captain Wellington dismounted his horse and handed the reins to a fellow guard. He walked directly toward the barrier where Margaret stood, his expression a mixture of shock, curiosity, and something that looked like hope. The crowd parted slightly as people realized something significant was happening, though they couldn't understand what. As he approached, Margaret could see tears forming in his eyes. The strong, disciplined soldier was struggling to maintain his composure as 50 years of unanswered questions suddenly seemed to have an answer. He stopped just inches from the barrier, his voice barely audible above the confused murmurs of the crowd. "Who are you?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the photograph in Margaret's trembling hands. "And how do you know that gesture?" Margaret's own eyes filled with tears as she realized that her long journey was finally nearing its end. She had found him, and more importantly, he had recognized the significance of what she was showing him. The secret that had burdened her for half a century was finally ready to be revealed. The royal carriage had stopped as well, its occupants undoubtedly wondering why their security detail had come to such an abrupt halt. In the distance, Margaret could see more security personnel approaching, and she knew she only had moments to explain herself before the situation escalated beyond her control. "My name is Margaret Thompson," she said softly, her voice steady despite her emotional state. "I was a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in 1971. Your mother, your birth mother, she made me promise to find you someday. She wanted you to know the truth about who you really are." Captain Wellington's world tilted on its axis as Margaret's words sank in. The parade route that had been filled with cheering crowds just moments before now felt eerily quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath. He looked down at the photograph in Margaret's hands, and for the first time in his life, he saw a face that shared his own features. The same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes, the same gentle smile that his adoptive mother had always said was special. "I need to see that photograph," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Without waiting for protocol, he reached across the barrier and gently took the image from Margaret's hands. As he turned it over and read the inscription, his legs nearly gave way beneath him. The initials E.M. matched a name he had wondered about his entire life, a name that appeared on his original birth certificate before the adoption papers sealed his records. Behind him, the royal security team was growing increasingly agitated. Chief Security Officer Davidson approached quickly, speaking into his radio with urgent, clipped tones. "We have a situation at Checkpoint 7. Captain Wellington has broken formation. Need immediate assessment of potential security threat." Margaret watched as more uniformed officers surrounded them, and she realized that her simple gesture had created a crisis that was spiraling out of control. The royal carriage remained stationary, its occupants surely demanding answers about the delay. Television cameras that had been filming the parade were now focused intently on the unusual scene unfolding at the barrier. "Sir, we need to move now," Davidson said firmly to Captain Wellington. "The schedule is completely disrupted, and we don't know what this woman's intentions are." But Wellington couldn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the photograph as memories flooded back. Memories of questions his adoptive parents couldn't answer, of dreams about a woman who sang lullabies in a voice he couldn't quite remember, of a birthmark that doctors said looked like a crescent moon, but that his adoptive family insisted was just a scar. Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out on his face, and she knew she had to act quickly before they were separated forever. "There's more," she said urgently, reaching into her purse again. "Your mother gave me this as well." She pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket that had been wrapped carefully in the same tissue paper as the photograph. The locket caught the sunlight and seemed to glow as Margaret held it up. Captain Wellington's eyes widened as he recognized the intricate engraving on its surface, a pattern of roses and thorns that looked remarkably similar to the royal family's personal jewelry. His hand instinctively went to his neck, where beneath his uniform collar he wore a matching silver chain that had been with him since childhood. "She told me this belonged to your grandmother," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with urgency. "She said it was passed down through generations of women who could never publicly claim their children. She wanted you to have it so you would know that you come from love, even if that love had to remain hidden." Chief Davidson was losing patience with the situation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from the barrier immediately. Captain Wellington, return to your position now, or I'll have you escorted from the parade route." But something extraordinary was happening. As Margaret opened the locket, a small piece of paper fell out, yellowed and fragile with age. Captain Wellington caught it before it hit the ground. And as he unfolded it carefully, he found himself looking at what appeared to be a partial birth certificate, one that listed a father's name he had never seen before. The name on the certificate made his blood run cold. It wasn't just any name. It was the name of a high-ranking member of the royal family who had died mysteriously in a car accident in 1972, just months after Captain Wellington's birth. The implications were staggering, and suddenly the secrecy surrounding his adoption began to make sense. "This can't be real," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it was true. The pieces of his life that had never quite fit together were suddenly forming a picture that was both wonderful and terrifying. Margaret nodded solemnly. "Your mother was Lady Elizabeth Morrison. She worked as a private secretary to the royal family, and she fell in love with someone she could never marry. When she became pregnant, arrangements were made to keep the pregnancy secret. She was sent away to a private clinic, and after you were born, You were placed with a loving family who were told never to reveal the truth about your origins. The crowd around them was growing restless, and Margaret could see news reporters pushing through the barriers, their cameras trained on the unfolding drama. What had started as a simple gesture of love was becoming a public spectacle that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Captain Wellington looked up from the documents in his hands and met Margaret's eyes. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did you wait 50 years to tell me this?" Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "I tried to find you many times over the years," she explained. "But the adoption was sealed so tightly that I couldn't get any information. It wasn't until I saw your photograph in the newspaper last year, when you received that commendation for bravery, that I recognized the resemblance to your mother. Even then, I wasn't completely certain until I saw that birthmark during the television coverage of the Queen's birthday parade." The royal carriage door opened, and a figure in formal dress stepped out onto the roadway. Margaret recognized him immediately as Prince Edward, one of the senior members of the royal family. His presence meant that whatever was happening here had attracted the attention of the highest levels of the monarchy. Prince Edward walked purposefully toward their group, his expression serious, but not unkind. He had clearly been briefed on the situation, because he approached Captain Wellington with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't the first time they had spoken about sensitive family matters. "James," Prince Edward said quietly, using Captain Wellington's first name in a way that immediately told Margaret this conversation was deeply personal. "I think we need to discuss this privately. There are things you should know, things that have been kept secret for good reasons. But perhaps it's time for the truth to come out." Captain Wellington looked between Prince Edward and Margaret, his mind racing to process the implications of what was being suggested. If what Margaret was telling him was true, then his entire life had been built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies designed to protect not just him, but the entire royal family from scandal. "The hospital records," Margaret said suddenly, reaching into her purse one final time. "I kept copies of everything from that night. The signatures, the medical reports, the emergency contact information. It's all here." She handed him a manila envelope that had been carefully preserved for 5 decades. As Captain Wellington opened the envelope, Prince Edward placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We've known about you for years, James. The family has been watching your career, your service record, your character. We've always been proud of the man you became, even though we couldn't acknowledge the connection publicly." The revelation hit Captain Wellington like a physical blow. Not only was he learning about his true parentage, but he was discovering that the royal family had been aware of his existence all along. They had been watching him, evaluating him, perhaps even guiding his career without his knowledge. Margaret watched as the two men continued their quiet conversation, and she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had successfully delivered the message she had promised to carry, but she could see that the consequences were far more complex than she had anticipated. The simple gesture of love from a dying mother had opened a door that could never be closed again. The crowd was becoming increasingly restless, and Margaret could hear the murmur of confusion and speculation growing louder. Television news crews were setting up equipment, and she realized that within hours, the entire world would be wondering about the elderly woman who had somehow caused a royal parade to stop. As she stood there watching Captain Wellington examine the documents that proved his royal heritage, Margaret felt the weight of 50 years finally lifting from her shoulders. She had kept her promise to a dying woman, and in doing so, she had given a man the truth about his identity that he had searched for his entire life. But she also realized that her simple act of kindness was about to change everything, not just for Captain Wellington, but potentially for the entire royal family. The secret that had been carefully guarded for half a century was about to become public knowledge, and there was no way to predict what the consequences might be. The next hour passed like a dream for Captain Wellington. He found himself in a private room at Buckingham Palace, still in his ceremonial uniform, surrounded by documents that told the story of his life in ways he had never imagined. Prince Edward sat across from him, along with the Queen's private secretary and a legal advisor who specialized in matters of royal lineage. Margaret had been escorted to the palace as well, though she remained in a separate room with a cup of tea and a kind elderly woman who identified herself as Lady Catherine, a longtime friend of the royal family. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the grandeur of her surroundings, but more than that, she felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced in decades. "The truth is, James," Prince Edward was saying, his voice gentle but serious, "your father was my older brother, Prince Michael. He died in that car accident when you were just 6 months old, but before his death, he had made arrangements for your care. He loved your mother deeply, and he loved you, even though he could never acknowledge either relationship publicly." Captain Wellington studied the photograph of Prince Michael that had been placed before him. The resemblance was undeniable. The same strong features, the same intense eyes, the same way of holding his head slightly tilted when deep in thought. For the first time in his life, he was looking at a face that was unmistakably related to his own. "Your mother, Lady Elizabeth, was more than just a private secretary," the Queen's secretary added. "She was trusted with some of the family's most sensitive matters, which is how she and Prince Michael came to work so closely together. When their relationship developed into something deeper, they both knew it could never be made public. The times were different then, and the rules about royal marriages were much stricter." James looked down at his hands, trying to process the magnitude of what he was learning. "So, I'm actually—" "You're my nephew," Prince Edward said simply. "You're Prince Michael's son, which makes you a direct descendant of the royal line. But more importantly, you're a good man who has served with honor and distinction for 25 years. That matters more than bloodlines." Meanwhile, in the other room, Margaret was sharing her own story with Lady Catherine. She explained how she had been a young nurse, fresh out of training, when Lady Elizabeth was brought to the hospital in the final stages of complications from childbirth. The attending physicians had done everything they could, but it was clear that she wasn't going to survive. "She was so beautiful," Margaret remembered, her eyes distant with memory. "Even dying, she had this elegance about her. But she was also terrified, not of dying, but of what would happen to her baby. She kept asking about him, wanting to make sure he was healthy and safe." Lady Catherine nodded understandingly. "Elizabeth was one of the finest people I ever knew. She was intelligent, compassionate, and utterly devoted to the royal family. Her relationship with Prince Michael was the great love of both their lives, but they understood the impossible position they were in." Margaret pulled out a small notebook from her purse, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. "I wrote down everything she told me that night. She talked about how much she loved Prince Michael, how they had planned to find a way to be together somehow. She described the secret meetings they had in the palace gardens, the letters they wrote to each other, the dreams they had for their future." As Margaret shared these intimate details, Lady Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes. The official royal record spoke of Prince Michael's tragic death and Lady Elizabeth's unfortunate passing due to medical complications, but they never captured the profound love story that had unfolded behind the palace walls. Back in the other room, James was learning about the careful arrangements that had been made for his upbringing. His adoptive parents, the Wellingtons, had been chosen specifically for their character, their stability, and their discretion. They had been told only that James was the child of a young woman from an important family who had died in childbirth, and that his future welfare was of great concern to certain highly placed individuals. They never knew the full truth, Prince Edward explained. but they were compensated generously for your care, and your education and career opportunities were quietly supported by the family. When you showed an interest in military service, strings were pulled to ensure you had the best training and opportunities for advancement. James felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion. So, my entire career, my position in the Royal Guard, none of it was really my own achievement? Don't underestimate yourself, Prince Edward said firmly. Yes, you had advantages that you didn't know about, but your character, your courage, your integrity, those things can't be bought or arranged. The family has been proud to watch you develop into the man you became, regardless of your bloodline. The legal advisor cleared his throat and leaned forward. There's another matter we need to discuss. Given the public nature of today's events and the media attention it's likely to generate, we need to decide how to handle this situation going forward. James realized that his quiet, private life was about to be turned upside down. The story of the royal guard who discovered his royal heritage would be irresistible to the press, and there was no way to put that genie back in the bottle. "What are my options?" he asked. "We can try to maintain the status quo," the advisor explained. "Issue a statement denying any family connection, seal the documents again, and hope the story dies down. Or we can acknowledge the truth and deal with the consequences publicly." Prince Edward studied James's face carefully. "The choice is yours, nephew. The family will support whatever decision you make. You can continue your life as it has been, or you can claim your place in the family publicly, but you should know that either path will have significant consequences." As the gravity of the decision settled on James's shoulders, a knock came at the door. Lady Catherine entered with Margaret, who looked small but determined in the opulent surroundings of the palace. "I think Mrs. Thompson should be part of this conversation," Lady Catherine said. "After all, none of this would have happened without her courage and dedication." Margaret looked directly at James. Her eyes filled with the wisdom of someone who had carried a secret for 50 years. "Your mother made me promise to find you and tell you the truth. But she also made me promise something else, that I would make sure you knew you had choices. She didn't want her love for you to become a burden or an obligation." James felt a profound connection to this elderly woman who had risked everything to honor a promise made to a dying stranger. "What do you think I should do?" Margaret smiled, and for a moment James could see in her expression the same gentle strength that had convinced a dying woman to trust her with the most important secret of her life. "I think you should do what feels right in your heart," she said simply. "Your mother loved your father, and she loved you. She wanted you to be happy and free to make your own choices. Whether you choose to be Captain James Wellington or Prince James doesn't matter as much as whether you choose to be yourself." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated Margaret's words. Finally, James stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the London streets where he had spent his entire life without knowing who he really was. After several long minutes, he turned back to face the group. His decision was clear in his expression before he even spoke. "I've spent my entire adult life serving the crown and the royal family," he said quietly. "I've done it with honor because I believed in what they represented. Learning that I'm part of this family doesn't change that. It just makes it more personal." He looked directly at Prince Edward. "I want to acknowledge the truth, but I want to continue serving as I always have. I don't need titles or ceremonies or public recognition. I just want to know that the promise Margaret made to my mother has been kept, and that the love my parents had for each other finally has a place in the light instead of hidden in shadows." Prince Edward smiled and stood to embrace his newly acknowledged nephew. "I think Prince Michael and Lady Elizabeth would be very proud of the man you've become." Margaret wiped away a tear as she watched the reunion unfold. After 50 years, she had finally completed the mission that a dying woman had entrusted to her, The quiet, secret gesture she had made during the parade had not only stopped the procession, it had reunited a family and brought a love story full circle. As the sun set over London that evening, the official announcement was carefully crafted and released to the press. It acknowledged Captain Wellington as a member of the extended royal family, while emphasizing his continued service and his choice to maintain his current position and lifestyle. Margaret returned to her small flat that night with a lightness in her step that she hadn't felt in decades. She had kept her promise, honored a dying woman's final wish, and given a good man the truth about his heritage. It had been, she reflected, a very good day's work indeed. The photograph of Lady Elizabeth and her newborn son now sat in a place of honor in James's private quarters, alongside the locket and the letters that had finally found their way home. And sometimes, when he was alone, James would touch the silver chain around his neck and remember that he was the product of a great love story, one that had taken 50 years to reach its proper conclusion.